Good morning, everyone. We'll just give all of our attendees a chance to join. We've had over 800 people registered to take part today, so we're just going to give a couple of minutes to let people in, and then we'll get started. Okay, we've got lots of people coming in now. We've had over 800 people register for today's event, which is a fantastic turnout, and we've got a great lineup in store for you. I'm Wes Streeting. I'm the Labour MP for Ilford North and Shadow Child Poverty Secretary, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the inaugural Progressive Britain Conference. We've got an action-packed day of debate and discussion in store for you, with a fantastic range of speakers from across the United Kingdom, including Labour leader Keir Starmer, who will be speaking to us shortly, dancing internet sensation and Scottish Labour's saviour Anna Sarwar, Welsh Labour's brand new Education Secretary Jeremy Miles, Claire Hanna from our sister party in Northern Ireland, the SDLP, and some of our leading lights in local government, including West Yorkshire's history-making Mayor Tracy Brabin and Chair of London Council's Georgia Gould. We've got David Miliband joining us from New York. And if all that weren't enough, joining the lineup of politicians, we've got some of the biggest brains in Britain and beyond to help us tackle some of the biggest questions facing our country and our party. Goodness knows we need them. In its present condition, the Labour Party is unable to deliver the change our country needs. Our defeat in 2019 was our worst since 1935, a comparison that actually does a disservice to Clem Attlee, who gained a large number of seats at that election. It was also our fourth defeat in a row. 4 defeats under very different leaders in very different circumstances. The last time we lost 4 times in a row was in 1992. Giles Radici wrote of Southern discomfort, analysing what he described as Labour's Southern problem. If only things were that simple now. Labour still has a Southern problem, with only 14 parliamentary seats outside of London in the whole of the south of England. But we also have a problem in the northeast and northwest of England, where Labour lost 20 seats, Yorkshire and the Humber, where Labour lost 9 seats, the East Midlands, where Labour lost 7 seats, the West Midlands, where Labour lost 9 seats, and the East of England, where Labour is down to 5 seats from just 7. Seats that have returned Labour MPs for the best part of a century went Conservative, and the result in Hartlepool shows that they won't just inevitably swing back to Labour. Even in London, which returned the single Labour gain of the election, we also lost a seat and Labour's vote share went down by 6.4%. In Scotland, Labour was on life support with just a single MP returned for the second time in 3 elections. Anna Sarwar's dynamic and energetic campaign helped Scottish Labour avoid the near-death experience predicted by the pundits and the polls, which had pointed to Labour in 4th place in Holyrood behind the Greens. And in Labour Wales, where Mark Drakeford's impressive leadership during the pandemic saw Welsh Labour achieve a majority in the Senedd, there's no room for complacency for the general election. The Labour Party has a problem with power. Since it was founded in 1900, the Labour Party has contested 31 general elections and won a working majority in only 5 of them, in 1945, 1966, 1997, 2001 and 2005. By any standards, this is a lamentable record for a major political party. The pattern has become all too familiar. Prolonged periods of opposition, interspersed with periods of Labour government, perennially plagued by dogma and division about what the Labour Party is for and who we are supposed to represent. The consequence has been a Conservative century. I spent a lot of time on the road during the recent election campaign. I campaigned in every English region and across 3 seats in South Wales. The mood on the doorstep has changed. A lot of the anger towards Labour has dissipated. People are beginning to give us a hearing again, but that doesn't mean they're flocking back. In some cases, they've moved even further away from us, and that comes with consequences too. Just up the road from me, I'm absolutely gutted that Basildon no longer has a Labour council. Gavin Callaghan, until the elections, the leader of Basildon Council, had a bold vision for Basildon's town centre, including a youth zone for young people. Now he can't deliver it. In Southampton, I saw firsthand the impressive work that Chris Hammond's Labour Council has been doing to tackle childhood hunger in the city through their school food programme, but now Labour's in opposition. Nottinghamshire's experienced police and crime commissioner Paddy Tipping and his talented deputy Emma Foodie made a real impact on crime across the county, but we lost to the Tories. It's galling, isn't it? The Labour team that successfully cut crime lost to the Tory party that's cut police. And before you write me off as a bad omen, I should point out I did campaign in some places that Labour won too. I was particularly pleased to see Marcus Didd and elected in Bingley, having lost so narrowly last time, Sarah Murphy win in Bridget, taking a place in the Senedd for the first time, and Dan Norris prevail in the west of England. But alongside positive signs of advance, like Nick Johnson's win in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, were too many examples of retreat. I'm not telling you all this to depress you. I'm an eternal optimist. All I'm saying is that I've got an easier time ahead beating kidney cancer than Keir's got leading the Labour Party. He's the best candidate for Prime Minister that any party has offered this country for a very long time. But the Labour Party has got to want to win. A winning mindset has to underpin everything we do. Our culture, our organisation, our policy platform. Our aim isn't simply to hold the government to account, it's to be the government. So it's not just renewal we need, it's reinvention. And that goes for Labour's centre-left modernising tradition too. The 2010s have been a low decade for the Labour Party, characterised by defeat, division and decay. All too often, those of us on the centre-left have found ourselves pigeonholed in the past and defined by what we're against rather than what we're for. Now is the time for a new generation to lead the debate about how we forge a broad-based, post-Brexit, post-pandemic settlement for the future of the United Kingdom. So I'm delighted to announce that Progress and Policy Network, two organisations that have done so much to shape thinking on the centre-left at home and throughout extensive international networks, are coming together to reboot and relaunch As Progressive Britain, a brand new platform for critical thinking, political education and policy making on the left. Rooted in the Labour Party, Progressive Britain's mission is simple: to support Keir to reinvent the Labour Party so that we can rebuild our country. This isn't just a job for politicians in Westminster. The leadership and heavy lifting must also come from beyond and below Westminster and Whitehall. For this process of renewal to be a success, it requires the active involvement of citizens and local communities, local, devolved and national politicians, policymakers, businesses and trade unions. We've got to stop taking for granted that voters will stick with Labour because of traditional family or community loyalties. And we can't get drawn into conservative attempts to create culture wars, division and competition between different parts of the country. Labour's continuing difficulties are not because we've changed too much, but because we haven't changed enough to be seen as the party that shares the priorities of the people. Sometimes we're barely having the same conversation as the country. So let's write a new story for our country and Labour's place within it. We're the 6th richest economy in the world. We're home to world-class universities, captains of industry, world-leading surgeons, and groundbreaking inventors, artists, and entrepreneurs. We're a global centre of music, literature, fashion, art, design, and film. Our military, foreign aid, diplomatic, and intelligence services provide a cornerstone of international development, peace, and security. 1.5 billion people around the world speak our language, and more than 40 million people visit the UK each year. But this is a country with intolerable levels of inequality in power, wealth, and opportunity. Child poverty was rising before the pandemic and is set to rise further still as a direct result of conservative policies. We are failing to care for people later in life. We're at the beginning of a technological revolution that is changing every aspect of our work, lives, and democracy, not just for better, but for worse too. There's a climate emergency that's burning our planet. Old adversaries like poverty, disease, and tyranny are manifesting themselves in new ways. It doesn't have to be like this. Progressive Britain will help Keir to write a new story for our party and our country. We believe that everyone deserves to live a good life, to have a place they can call home, to have a good job that provides an income that does more than just pay the bills, to have quality time to spend with friends and family, to enjoy arts and culture, sport and recreation. We want Britain to be the best place in the world to grow up, with every childhood filled with joy and discovery. We want this to be the best place to grow old. We believe that everyone deserves to enjoy their retirement, not just to look back on a life well lived, but to live life to the full until the very end. We believe that the state, the private sector, and civil society have a shared role to play in promoting our flourishing. We believe that we're temporary custodians of the world that we share together, and that each of us has a responsibility to care for our environment and the life on earth that it sustains. We care about the world beyond our own islands, and we wish to see a world without hunger and hardship, tyranny and oppression, and needless suffering. Our ambitions and our aspirations for ourselves, our families, our communities, our country, and our planet aren't radical, but achieving them really would be. Throughout the party's 120-year history, every Labour government has changed our country for the better, but our time in government has been too short and the agony of opposition too long. Our values are timeless, but they are meaningless unless they're made real by Labour governments elected by the people. Power and principle go hand in hand. So let's meet that challenge as reformers of our broken economic system and as champions of a dynamic and enterprising economy where economic prosperity and social justice go hand in hand and things like child poverty are history. Let's deliver the biggest devolution of power and resources in our country's history to put power close to the people. And let's put forward a plan for our public services based on investment and reform, delivering more flexible, responsive and relational public services so that people in all parts of this country can take greater control over their lives and their destinies. Let's return to the tried and tested approach of being tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime as the party of law and order. Let's reform our broken social care system and our attitudes to old age so that retirement is something to look forward to rather than something to fear. Let's build a lifelong learning system that provides opportunities for learning from the cradle to the grave. Let's make sure that the technological revolution is one that leads to better quality work and higher living standards for everyone. Let's make this industrial revolution a green industrial revolution, using every lever available to incentivise the right behaviour and decarbonise our economy, recognising that government can't do this alone. Let's make the transition to a zero carbon economy a just transition, not simply preventing the further decline of communities that experience the sharp end of import shocks, globalisation and rapid deindustrialisation, but actively seeking to reverse those trends so that those communities reap the benefit of green industry and green jobs. Let's present the UK to the world as a beacon of democracy, freedom and human rights, a force for good in the world in the best traditions of our party. Progressive Britain will work tirelessly to develop the winning platform we need to deliver a Labour government. And I believe that our first special guest has the qualities we need in Britain's next Prime Minister. So to chair our first session, it's with great pleasure that I hand over to a woman I've done lots of campaigning with and someone I hope to see in Keir Starmer's winning Labour parliamentary party. Let me hand over to Ashley Dalton.
Thanks, Wes.
There you are, thank God. I'm glad it was almost seamless transition. I was really worried then. Over to you.
Almost. Thank you very much, Wes. Welcome, everybody. We've got a real treat for you next, and I'm sure that this has been a massive draw for today's conference. What we're going to do for this next session is we're going to be joined by Sir Keir Starmer, leader of the Labour Party. This is Keir's opportunity, one of the first opportunities really, to speak directly to the membership following the recent elections. What we're going to do is Keir's going to have a few minutes initially where he's going to say a few words, and then Keir and I are going to have a bit of a chat about some of his experiences in the past year running the Labour Party, and also about some of the themes and the issues that are facing the Labour Party today. So without further ado, I give you Sir Keir Starmer, leader of the Labour Party.
Thank you.
There you go.
Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Ashley. And thank you, Wes, also for your introductory remarks. And Wes, and I know I speak for so many people when I say this, and it's great to say it here this morning. It's so fantastic that we've got you in the shadow cabinet as one of the leading advocates for our party and our movement. So Wes, thank you for that. And I'm sure, again, I speak on behalf of absolutely everybody on this conference, on this meeting this morning, in wishing Wes well in the cancer operation that he's about to go off and have. The thoughts of the whole party are with you, Wes, and the support of the whole party is with you. And I'm delighted, Ashley, to be here with Progressive Britain because the whole theme is rebuilding the nation, a platform, the ideas, the imagination, the innovation to rebuild the nation. And in a sense, that takes me back to 2014, when I had just about a year out of having been the director of public prosecutions. And obviously I could have gone back to be a human rights lawyer. I'd done many years as a human rights lawyer working around the world. I could have written the book I've been meaning to write for years, or I could have gone and worked at one of my secret desires is to go work in a bookshop in Kentish Town. But instead of that, I opted for frontline politics. And I'm very glad that I did, because I could see back in 2014 the huge damage that the then government was doing, particularly through cuts to public services. I've been running a public service, and I could see firsthand what happens when you take 20, 30% cuts into our public services. In my fielding there, criminal justice, but of course across the piece, huge impact on our public services. And I could see part of what I thought was the almost post-war settlement on how you supported people with public support services being torn up with those cuts that were coming in. I could see the impact of inequality and poverty on the lives of millions of people. And I can tell you, and some of you will have had this experience, you don't need to sit for long in the back of a criminal court to see case after case after case of people coming before the courts, either charged with offences or as victims, who've been deeply impacted by cuts and austerity, and going round and round a familiar cycle, an unbreaking cycle. You don't need to sit for long, by the way, in the back of a housing court either, to see people being evicted because they can't pay the rent, to see people losing their houses because they can't pay the mortgage. And you didn't need to sit for long in the back of a family court to see the huge impact on family life of what was happening back then in 2014 with the cuts to our public services, with the stripping away of all the support that Labour governments have put in over so many years. And so, for me, that decision in 2014 was all about change. It was always about recognising that if we were going to do anything about this, we had to change things pretty fundamentally. Because what was happening in 2014 was the dismantling of what the last Labour government had achieved, whether that was rebuilding our NHS and our schools, whether it was massively reducing poverty in relation to pensioners and children, whether it was the Equality Act, the Climate Change Act, you name it, it was being stripped away, dismantled in 2014. And that drove me to go into frontline politics. And by the way, never ever downplay or underestimate the change that Labour makes in power. We made huge change to millions of lives between 1997 and 2010. And we need to remember that. That's the difference we make in power. Now, obviously, fast forward 6-7 years to today's conference. And what have we got? We've got a situation in relation to the poverty and inequality caused by austerity that's much worse. We've had 10 years worth of cuts. And talk to anybody on the front line in local government, and you hear the familiar tale time after time after time. One of the tragedies of the pandemic was that our local authorities had the spirit, the determination and the commitment to step up to support their communities, but were held back by a government that had underfunded them for years after year after year. Add to that, of course, we're now in a post-Brexit world. That may not have been the world that we voted for. I didn't vote for that. I wanted to remain, but it's the world we're in. And the challenge now is, how do we make that work? How do we make a success of that? Add to that, coming out of the pandemic, a pandemic that has brutally exposed the inequalities and insecurities in our society, brutally exposed them. But also shown the sort of spirit of solidarity and empathy that is there. So I'm really glad that Progressive Britain is focusing on this issue of how we rebuild our nation in the circumstances we find ourselves in. Of course, that invites the question, and the programme today is a brilliant set of discussions about what sort of change do we want. And Wes has just said, and I'll say again, what we want is for Britain to be the best place to grow up in, the best place to grow old in, and the best place to work in and to feel secure and have opportunity and aspiration and hope at each stage of life. Now, that's the easy bit, saying that. The hard bit, of course, is what does that mean? And the change we need to bring about, and this is the challenge for Progressive Britain, it's the challenge for all of us, it's got to be transformative. And it's got to be modernising. And let me just give a few examples of that, starting with our economy. In our economy, absolutely getting worse. And that is because our economy is set on a short-term basis. We want returns for shareholders on a short-term basis. We don't invest for the long term. That leads to low standards, low wages, insecure working. It also leads to lack of productivity, lack of investment in research and development. And therefore, we've got an economy with baked-in inequality and insecurity, and which doesn't work on its own terms. And we need to change that into a longer-term economy where we have high wage, high skills, high standards and long-term investment, better productivity. And there is a window of opportunity here, because an active Labour government working to that agenda with really progressive people and business leaders can work together. All the business leaders who know the change that's needed know that it's to switch to a longer-term economy. So there's a real opportunity for a partnership here between Labour, an active Labour government, and business that will absolutely reset the economy in a way which will bring about transformative change, and of course green change with it, because the jobs of the future are green jobs. And seeing the role of government in innovation and securing those green jobs is hugely important, hugely challenging, hugely exciting. So we've got to reset the economy. Second thing is skills and education. There isn't a world-class education for every child in this country. There just isn't. It varies across the country, and a lot of what happened in the last Labour government has gone backwards in the last 10 years. And that needs to be reset, and we need a brand new skills agenda. When I was Shadow Immigration Secretary, I went around the country talking to businesses, and the question I asked them, this was pre-Brexit, by the way, was what's the single thing that's holding you back most? And they said lack of skills. So we need a skills agenda, particularly for those who aren't going to university. We have never focused enough on that, in my view. The third thing we need to do, and Wes touched on this, is to look again at public services. Public services have been starved of funding, but the answer is not just to resource them better, although that is part of the answer, of course it is. It's to be bold enough to look at what our public service is delivering and in what way. We need a preventative model. I don't know how many people I've seen going through the criminal justice system who wouldn't have been there if there'd been a preventative model which had captured problems and dealt with them as they arose, rather than trying to fix them after the event. And we need that desperately in the NHS, and we need that very clearly in social care. The third thing we need to do is to devolve more power and influence to people closer to them. And I don't mean a technical question of, what powers are held in Westminster versus Scotland versus Wales. I mean actual decisions much, much closer to people. Strategic plans for regions. What's the strategic plan for the Humber region that brings together resource, skills, funding, infrastructure, and decision making closer to people in a really meaningful, devolved way. And beyond that too, some of the best social and council housing that's been put up in recent years by progressive councils has been when those that are going to live in it have been consulted and involved in the decision making on it. And then the fifth transformation and modernisation we need is in our culture, because for years, best part of a decade now, across the US, across Europe and here in this country, the culture has been one of division, looking for what divides people, whether that's old and young, whether it's rural and urban, whether it's town and city, whether it's black and white. We need to change that culture to one that draws on our values of empathy, of standing together, of support, and finding those points that unite us across the country, across the United Kingdom. So we need a future-looking, transformative, modernising agenda. I'm interested in the question of what the 2020s and 2030s look like. I'm not interested in the question of what the past looked like. We have to be forward-looking. And whenever people say, well, where are you on the political spectrum, et cetera, Keir, I say I'm forward-looking. I want our country to be better in the future, solving the problems of the 2020s and 2030s. And that's why I'm really pleased that Annalisa Dodds is doing our policy review. And that will not be a policy review that starts by picking up the last manifesto and going through it, saying, what are we going to keep, what are we not going to keep? That is not how you do this, or the 2019 manifesto, or the 2017, or the 2015. Not interested in starting from past manifestos. I'm interested in starting with answering the questions of the future based on the values that we have as a Labour Party. And this piece of work by Progressive Britain will be, I think, really important feeding into that. But I will say this, Ashley, just to bring this to a close. If we are to transform and to modernise Britain, and that's what we must do, transform and modernise Britain, we have to transform and modernise our party. We have to change our party to change Britain, because we have spent far too long as an inward-facing party when we should be facing out, facing the voters, engaging with the voters. That's what a 21st century Labour Party does. So we have to transform and modernise our party. We have to look outwards. We have to have that connection rather than looking inwards and fighting over internal battles and squabbles within our own party. And we have to have a very, very effective campaigning machine. And that's why I'm really delighted that Shabana is leading as our national campaign coordinator, because she can drive through the change that we need in our party and make it that effective campaigning machine. And all of this work has to be accelerated now after the set of elections we had just 10 days or so ago, particularly Hartlepool. And Progressive Britain can, and I hope will, play a central part in the important change that we need to bring about in our party, the important change we need to bring about for our country, to answer the questions of the future and to do what we do very rarely as a party, which is to bring together the ability to glimpse the future and persuade people that a future under a Labour government is better for them. When we do that, we did it in 45, we did it in the 60s, and we did it in 97. The uniting thing of those three sets of election successes is we were facing the future. We were promising change that meant something to people, and people could look us in the eye and say, I think you can deliver that. That's the sort of change I want for our country. And that's the place we need to get into by the next general election. And this piece of work today is a really important contribution to it. Ashley, thank you very much for those, Jos, to make those opening remarks.
Thank you. And thanks, Keir, for really kind of setting out for all of us what, the need for us to change and what the opportunities are for us to do that. And in our conversation this morning, I want to pick up on a few of the themes and the ideas that you've put forward. But to start with, I just wanted to go back at the start of your few words. You talked about your journey to where you are. You've been leader of the Labour Party for just over a year now. So I just wondered, what have you enjoyed about that, and what has perhaps been a little bit more challenging?
Oh, well, we could be here for a long time. Thank you, Ashley. I mean, look, what I've enjoyed, there is no substitute for that moment on the 4th of April last year when I was named as leader of the Labour Party. I joined the Labour Party when I was 16 years old, and the idea of leading this great party that has made such huge change to people's lives in the governments that we've been able to put together was, a moment of great pride and privilege and enjoyment, and a fantastic moment. And thank you to everybody who supported me into that moment and supported me since. More generally, Ashley, what I've enjoyed is actually being out there talking to people again. And as the restrictions have come off, it's been amazing to do it. We got so used to Zoom, we almost forgot what it's like to be out in a high street, talking to people, knocking on doors, talking to people. The human reaction and interaction is hugely important. And, and I know I've said this again, but I'm beyond frustrated with not being able to have got out and spoken to a live audience yet. I've not done a speech to a live audience and not had the ability to have those conversations. And it does make a huge difference. As restrictions ease, I think it will be easier now to do it, but there's no substitute for that. And the sort of conversations you need to have can't really be done effectively at distance. They need to be up close. I mean, as for the challenge or the worst, Hartlepool, it was, a body blow. To lose Hartlepool in the way we lost Hartlepool was really tough, and none of us should shy away from that. The results, across the piece were more mixed, of course, but Hartlepool was a very sharp reminder of the scale and the extent of the change that we need and still need more. So a lot of enjoyment, Ashley, a lot of challenges. I think, Hartlepool is undoubtedly a low moment. I'm sure every party member and supporter would say the same. And it is because it is a reminder of the scale and the extent of the task that we have ahead of us. We've got a mountain to climb. I've said that many times. We are climbing that mountain, but it was a reminder of just how high the summit is.
Yeah, thanks for that. You mentioned there that you joined the Labour Party when you were 16. And so as part of that journey, since then, you've held perhaps two of the most senior positions in British society. You've been Director of Public Prosecutions and leader of the Labour Party. So that 16-year-old, when they joined the Labour Party, what kind of career aspirations did you have then?
Well, to be honest, when I was 16, I think I was still rather hoping that I might play football or do something else altogether. I'm not, at age 16, I'm not even sure I would have known what the Director of Public Prosecutions was. When I went off to university to study law, I'm not sure I knew the difference between solicitor and barrister even, so let alone what the Director of Public Prosecutions did. So that wasn't in my sights. And I don't think, having joined the East Surrey Young Socialists, which was a very small group back then, I don't, the idea that I'd have the opportunity to lead the Labour Party, I think wouldn't have crossed my mind. And as it is, I went off and did, became a lawyer and realised that through human rights lawyering, you could change people's lives in a number of really important ways. But I mean, just reflecting on your question, Ashley, the two roles. What's been the difference between the two roles is this: as Director of Public Prosecutions, I was effectively in power. I was empowered to make decisions and could change things. And therefore, where I saw problems in our criminal justice system, for example, in the way we dealt with violence against women and girls, where there are profound limitations and problems, I think, we were able to recognise the problem, join with others and change things because we held power, or I held power as head of the Crown Prosecution Service and part of the criminal justice team. That is power. One of my frustrations in all the time I've been an MP is that we've been in opposition. And in opposition, you're not changing anything. You may say lots of things, you may tweet merrily about how you voted, but you're not changing things profoundly. You're usually losing votes and not making a change. And so what I look forward to most is being the leader of the Labour Party, of a Labour government in power that is actually changing lives, because If you're not doing that, you're not really doing what all of us came into politics for. It's a reminder yet again of the importance of winning elections.
And on that note, turning to recent events, the elections that we've just had were a bit of a mixed bag, as everybody's touched upon this morning. Obviously, disappointment in Hartlepool, but also Durham, Sheffield, amongst others. But then, Scotland wasn't the disaster that everybody had predicted. And we saw success in Wales and our big cities. And as you touched upon, some remarkable gains in Cambridgeshire, Peterborough and the west of England. And also, some Labour councils where we held steady and where we made some small gains. So that's a pretty complicated picture at the moment. What do you think that complicated picture means for the Labour Party, and how do we work out what the lessons are that we need to learn from it?
Well, actually, it is mixed, and let's start with some of the more positives. In Wales, it was a really good result, a really, really good result, and it puts us in the driving seat in Wales, not just to complete the work that Mark Draper's been doing on the pandemic, but to take Wales forward with the programme of change. And I campaigned with Mark Draper quite a lot in these elections, and I was really struck as we walked down high streets across Wales, including North Wales as well as South Wales, and as we knocked on doors, how many people genuinely recognised the work that he had done in leading Wales through a very difficult period. It was genuine. Even people who weren't necessarily Labour voters could see that his straightforward approach, where he said what he was going to do and then did it without great flamboyancy, was very reassuring. And he carried a lot of people with him on that journey. And that is another reminder of the difference that Labour makes in power, and the difference you can make in power. And I'm really glad that Welsh Labour's been returned in Wales, because they do deserve to finish off the job that they're doing in relation to the pandemic, and they do deserve the job to take Wales forward. In Scotland, Anas ran a very energetic, committed campaign, and was, I thought, really good in setting up the divide in Scotland, the separation points, in his characterisation of the SNP as taking us back to the division of another referendum, of the Tories of taking us back to the broken system before we went into the pandemic, but of Labour focusing on the recovery. And he was very, very clear in that central argument that he was prosecuting, and that in Scotland we needed to find what unites us, not what divides us. And I thought that was very, very effective. And obviously, we didn't, we're not where we need to be in Scotland by a long shot. We mustn't get in the warm bath of thinking that that Scotland is where we need it to be. It isn't by a very, very long shot. And there's a huge amount of work to do. And Anas and I both know that. But we did, we started the campaign on about 14% and ended it on about 21, 22%. And so he did a huge amount of hard work. In the mayoralties, obviously, we re-secured important mayoralties very well. I mean, Andy Burnham did a fantastic job up in Greater Manchester. Sadiq, of course, was returned, and and others were returned as well. And we picked up 3 new mayoralties, and we shouldn't overlook that. Tracy Brabin, the first female Labour mayor. This has got to change. And she, we need to build on that. But winning in West Yorkshire was very important for us. Nick Johnson, of course, won in Peterborough and Cambridgeshire, and then Dan Norris down in the west of England, picking up votes in areas where we need to pick up votes. So it was mixed, but none of that takes away from the bitter disappointment about Hartlepool, where on first analysis, it looks like all of the Brexit vote from 2019 went straight into the Tory column, and a lot of the Labour vote didn't turn out in the way that we had expected. And, what are the lessons out of this? Well, there are many, but one is, whatever the change we've made to the party and our thinking, we haven't done enough, and we've got to do more. And that's why today's event is really important. It's why being very focused, not describing the change you want to bring about is fine, the vision. The really key question is, how do you actually bring it about? And that is the central, most important question, I think, that runs through these elections, runs through everything I've been trying to do since I've been Labour leader, which is not just talk about change, but actually have the answers to how you bring about change.
Absolutely. And you touched on there some of those sort of little shifts that we've seen in voting patterns, with, voters traditionally that might have traditionally voted Labour moving away from us, but also as making gains in some other places, and particularly the changes in the north of England. And we've talked a lot in recent times about the red wall, and it's crucially important. Obviously, we can't win a general election without it, but also I'm sure, as you've touched on, we can't win a general election with only it. So what do we need to do to ensure that we're a national party that can actually garner support from right across all of our countries and our regions?
Well, look, I couldn't agree more. I don't particularly like the phrase the red wall, but we know broadly what we mean by that swathe of seats that we lost in 2019, and we do need to win those seats back. There is no route back to power without winning those seats back, nor should we aspire to win power without winning those seats back. So we do have to have an answer for the so-called red wall. And I'm really glad that Deborah Matheson is joining the team, because if anybody knows about the red wall, she absolutely does, through all the work that she's done, particularly on the red wall, but more generally over many, many years on voters across the whole of the United Kingdom. So that red wall, I think that there are a number of things we need to just be clear in our mind. Firstly, the red wall, so-called, stretches across the northeast, top of the Midlands, into bits of the northwest and into North Wales. I don't think we should think that it's all one fixed mindset, because I just don't think that it is. So, for example, if you take the Brexit vote in North Wales, it looks by and large as though that came back towards Labour, whereas, of course, in Hartlepool, it didn't. So we mustn't overgeneralize here. I think we also probably make a mistake if we think the red wall is all about geography, because if you go to the east of England, if you go to places like Plymouth, some of the issues that are there about disenchantment, lack of influence, feeling that Labour is too far from our communities and working people, that's there in other parts of the country. So I think it's about a political answer. But of course, you're right that even if we were to solve all of that, and we must, that on its own isn't enough. That will just put us back where we were in 2015. And we must also recognise that for every seat we lost in the so-called red wall, we've been losing seats around them for the best part of 10 years. And so it's a bigger coalition than that we need to build. And there are issues across the whole of the United Kingdom where there are real points of unity. What do we do about young people? It's something Mark Drakeford looked at specifically in Wales. It's something we had an offer on in England and us in Scotland. Same with social care. What are the answers to social care? There are unifying points across the country, but I think it's a mistake to overgeneralize about what the red wall is and to think there's only one answer. But I'm very clear that we've got to win back those red wall seats. We have also got to improve in Scotland. And as I've said many times before, if you draw a line from London to Bristol and look south, I've forgotten, I think it's about 106 seats, and we've only got a handful of them. So we've also got to win in the south, the southwest, and the southeast. So the task is huge, and it's points of unity that we need to focus on.
Thanks for that. The task is huge, and you talked earlier about how we as a party need to change, and we need to start making those changes. So talking of changes, we can't talk today without touching on it. What's the real story behind last weekend's reshuffle, and what changes do you hope that that's designed to deliver?
Well, let me tell you the changes I wanted to bring about, because there's no pretending the last week has been a pleasant experience for any of us, or a good one for the Labour Party. But the changes I wanted to bring about was, firstly, Ange Rayner into more front-facing role, away from chair of the party, which is internal-facing, into a front-facing role. And we've succeeded in that, and that's fantastic, because Ange has a real ability to communicate, to connect, and is a real asset to us as a front-facing person within the shadow cabinet. So that move was very important to me in terms of the thinking about how we went forward as a shadow cabinet, and that's good. So Ange no longer chair, now front-facing. Good. Annalisa Dodds then into chair of the party and policy review, hugely important. And Annalisa has all of the skills necessary to pull together that policy review, and she's already started working on it and already drawing in members of the shadow cabinet. And of course, Progressive Britain will feed into this policy review, I hope. So Ange Rayner front facing, Annalisa Dodds to chair and policy review, Rachel Reeves into shadow chancellor, which is fantastic. So that was the third thing that I wanted to change, and we did. And then we've got Shabana into the campaigns coordinator role to drive through the change we need in the party as far as campaigns are concerned. And we've brought in, really good new talent in, Wes Streeting and others up to the shadow cabinet. So when the dust settles on this, and I'm not going to pretend the last week has been anything other than really, really difficult. When the dust settles, we've got Ange Rayner into that front-facing role. We've got Annalisa Dodds into the policy review and chair role. We've got Rachel Reeves into the shadow chancellor. We've got Shabana into the changing the campaigning or the way we campaign in the party. And we got Wes Streeting up onto the front line in the shadow cabinet. So as I face the next week, it's those positives, because that's the change I wanted to bring about. That's what I wanted to achieve. We got there, and now we face the future with a much stronger and better placed team. But as I say, the way we did it wasn't the best, and there's no getting away from that.
Thanks for that. You touched on Annalisa's new role in terms of policy review, which you spoke about earlier. And, as you've highlighted as well, we're all here this weekend because to a certain extent, we want to be a part of working with you and the party to develop that new offer, and an offer that not only is transformative and modernising, but also can connect to voters and ultimately win power in the country. So what is the thinking? What are the ideas and what are the plans that you've got? And obviously Annalisa is going to be playing a key role in that, to tap into not only the best ideas from our movement and from our party, but also from our communities who we seek to represent, in order to build that offer that really speaks to people's aspirations and fears?
Yeah, I think there are two aspects of this, Ashley. The first is mindset, and the second is process. But the mindset is much, much more important in terms of what is it that we're trying to achieve here, because what we're trying to achieve is the development of the forward-looking ideas for the future. As I said, answering the question of the 2020s and 2030s. And you can't answer those questions with yesterday's answers. You just can't. And so the mindset is forward-looking. And everybody on this call, everybody who's going to be involved, needs to be in that mindset. It is for that reason that you don't engage on a piece of work like this by fishing out the last manifesto and saying, let's start here and go through it line by line, deciding what we're keeping or leaving. And we're not going to do that. That is a past manifesto, just as the 2017-2015 manifestos are past manifestos. Doesn't mean we don't draw on good ideas wherever they come from, but you don't go through a review like this by immediately picking up the last document. You actually have to face the future and base it on the values that we've got going forward as a party. And that's, it is post-austerity, post-Brexit, post-pandemic Britain, and joining that together. There are three different but now conjoined challenges. we know what austerity has done in 10 years of this government, and we must never let Johnson pretend that he's just 18 months into a new Conservative government and he can unhinge himself from what went before. Post-Brexit is what does that post-Brexit Britain really look like now, and how do we establish that we can lead on as a post-Brexit Britain, and of course post-pandemic, and at the end of the pandemic, which I hope is not far off, we've got the choice either to go back and try and patch up what we had before, or to go on to something better, and we've got to go down the second of those paths. So that's the mindset, and I want really to get this across to everybody who's on the line now. This is our piece of work. What happens next is going to be part of history, and we have to own it. We have to develop those ideas, and we have to get the offer right going into the next general election. Nobody is going to do it for us, and we can't hug someone from the past, some historical figure, and say all we need is X. We've got to do it. The hard work is on us. The process will be relatively straightforward. And one thing I'm not going to do is let process get in the way of good ideas. If good ideas are coming thick and fast, they will come into this review by hook or by crook. It will be done through Annalisa, but there are other bits of work that are going on. There's the Constitutional Commission work that Gordon Brown is helping us with. And I'm certainly going to spend the summer out in different communities, having discussions about the future. And what I mean by that, Ashley, is not just sort of half-day visits. I'm going to go for 2 or more days to a particular place. I want to go to places where we need to win votes. And I don't want, it's always good to meet party members and party supporters. I don't want a room full of the faithful, clapping, etc. I actually want to spend my time talking to people who are not voting Labour. They're the people I want to spend the summer talking to. And I'm going to have this will be for the whole of the shadow cabinet, whole of the front bench, an exercise in depth in actually having those conversations with those that we need to vote for us. So it's a big piece of work. But as I say, whatever the process is, I'm not going to let that get in the way of the good ideas that need to come forward. What I would do is encourage everybody to be part of it.
That's really, really encouraging to hear that we're going to be sort of reaching out and speaking to people, and particularly those people that have felt that maybe they haven't been able to support Labour in recent years. How do we make sure, how do we give ourselves the tools to perhaps hear some things that might be pretty difficult? I think, the voters out there have got things to say to the Labour Party that we might find pretty difficult to hear, and that we might want to defend ourselves against. How do you think we should be addressing those conversations when people tell us things that we might actually find quite difficult?
Well, the first thing is we need to use our ears. One of the issues we've undoubtedly faced over recent years is a sense that many people have that we sit somewhere devising ideas and policies which we think are good for people, and then tell them what it is. Whereas in my experience, most of the good ideas I've ever had actually come from conversations with people affected. One of the things I did when I was Director of Public Prosecutions was to visit. We had about 100 offices across England and Wales. I had about 5,000 staff, and I would go to each of the offices on a regular occasion. But one of the first things I would always do, whatever the supposed agenda for the day, was to say, can I have a confidential meeting on my own with the most junior members of staff on their own for an hour to start with? And then I would simply say things like, what's the biggest problem that you've got? How are you fixing it? What's your workaround? Because staff will always have got to work. They know what the problem is, and they will have begun to try and solve it. And I also asked them a simple question, which was things like, when did you last get thanked by your line manager? Which told me a huge amount about the office. We need a version of the same, which is listening to people and engaging with people. That's why over the summer I'm going to be going to workplaces, community centres, etc. As I say, I don't want a room full of Labour Labour supporters. I want to do something much more difficult in many respects, much more challenging. What we're not doing is simply gathering up thoughts and then trying to write something that reflects those thoughts, because we need transformative and modernising change, and change is the important word here. But if we don't have that engagement, and if people can't see that what is changing is what they want changed in their lives, they will never believe in it. And that's why it's profoundly important. Devolution is such one of these words we use all the time. Nobody knows what the hell it means when you talk about it in the street or in the cafe or in the pub. What I have in my mind is, for an area, the Humber region I've used as an example, but what is the plan that brings together infrastructure, jobs, skills, education, hope and community engagement in an area like the Humber region? And how do we make sure that people in the Humber region, or wherever it may be, you could pick any region, are fully involved in the decision making? That's the sort of devolution I'm much more interested in. That not formally as this power exercise in the Scottish Parliament or our Parliament. Actually, let's stick with the Humber region, how do communities there really input into a strategic plan, and it is a strategic plan, long-term plan for their region, where we gain power as a Labour government with the confidence and the boldness to actually then push power closer to where people really are, and they can influence decisions in their own area, region, whatever it may be. That comes through listening and not just, as I say, to pick up views and then try to reflect them, but to properly understand the change that people are so desperate. And in my experience, once you start those conversations, there are huge points of unity. People really want a better economy. They may not say, I want a better economy, but low wages, low skills, insecurity at work, these are huge issues for people. And we need, and they have hope and aspiration. They want a better life for themselves, for their children, for their family, for their community. There's a huge pride that people have in their. We often talk about place. There's a huge pride of place that we need properly to understand. And it's that bit, I think, that is vitally important for us as we go forward.
Thank you. So, final question for our session today. You've laid out, all of the reasons why we need to change, and you've laid out some, for me personally, some really exciting sort of fundamentals about how we do that. That we're going to go out and sit at the back and listen for a while rather than always being at the front talking, which I think is really exciting. So we've all gathered here today, as we've touched upon. So what can we do as Progressive Britain to help deliver that? One,
be active, be involved, and whether that's feeding into Progressive Britain, whether that's feeding through Progressive Britain into the Labour Party review, which I hope everybody will do, whether it's going beyond just feeding in those ideas to actively be involved in politics in our party, because, as I say, we need to transform and modernise our party if we're going to transform and modernise Britain, and therefore we all need to be part of that and see it as one joined exercise. I don't think you can do one without the other. So be part of that participation, whether it's at the local level or the national level. And as I say, the mindset has to be a future-looking mindset, looking to what that future holds and feeding into it, being the eyes and ears of the Labour Party. Many people involved in Progressive Britain will themselves be engaged and involved in what's going on in their communities. That is hugely valuable, hugely important. So all of that needs to be drawn together with a great positivity, because, if we are able to transform and change our party so we can transform and change Britain, we are doing what we came into politics to do. It is really hard and it's really exciting. It's a challenge, but it's a fantastic, what a thing to be charged with. In the 21st century, post-pandemic, being charged with, given the responsibility to bring together you know, the change that our country so desperately needs. Is it a lot of sweat and blood and hard work? You bet it is. But what a fantastic opportunity it also is, you know, a real privilege that we can be part of the change that we need to see in our country. And I'm really looking forward to working with everybody on this. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Keir. Thanks for laying that out and setting us that challenge. And I think I can speak for everyone on the call to say that we're all looking forward to driving that and making that happen and seeing the changes we want to see in the country. Thanks for being with us this morning.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So thanks to Keir for that. What we're going to do next is move on to start having some of those discussions and thinking about how we turn some of those ideas and those opportunities and those visions into a reality. And the first thing that we're going to do in this next session is look at what's happened recently, May 2021, you know, what the snapshot is of where we are as a party, and how do we rewrite our role in the national story. We've got a couple of people that have joined us that are going to help us do that. So we've got Karl Pike. Karl is a lecturer in British politics and public policy at Queen Mary, University of London. And he's Deputy Director of the Mile End Institute. Prior to being an academic, Karl worked for the Labour Party. And we also have with us Chris Curtis. Chris is Senior Research Manager at Opinion, which is a market research and insight agency known for political polling and insight. And prior to joining Opinion, Chris was Research Manager at YouGov. So I'm just going to hand over to them now, and they're going to take us through some of the ideas and the concepts that we might start exploring today. So over to you.
Thanks, Ashley. Okay, I'm going to have a quick go at just sharing a couple of slides, so bear with me a second. Hopefully you guys can all see that. As Ashley said, I'm based at Queen Mary, University of London, and we recently did a project which was about trying to understand where people were at in terms of post-pandemic rebuilding. And in particular, we were thinking about the government's phrase, but also obviously the phrase that's being used elsewhere, including the United States, which is this build back better phrase. And we really wanted to understand from the public, you know, what do they consider to be the important things about post-pandemic rebuilding and post-pandemic recovery. And here is a list of their priorities, so people could pick 2 or 3, and perhaps unsurprisingly, the NHS was top of that list. And obviously we need to particularly consider the pressures that the pandemic has brought, but also the backlog it has created. I think it's really important for policymakers to understand the sort of sustained support that the NHS is going to need to be given, both in the immediate future, but over the next few years and onwards as well. The second and third priorities, unemployment and jobs, mental health. I mean, I think, again, just taking mental health as an example for a second, you know, there have been some really serious warnings from the Royal College of Psychiatrists, for example, about the impact of the pandemic on young people's mental health in particular. And, you know, I think people were, you know, looking for a response from the government and have been looking for a response from the government. It was mentioned in the Queen's speech that things would be brought forward in the future alongside things like social care, but there were no concrete plans to speak of. So I think, you know, what did we take from this overall, and in terms of these sort of headline results? I think people are really engaged with the serious effects of the pandemic, and you know, I think your mental health being in the top 3, for example, I think was really important for us. I think people are looking for quite detailed and quite clear plans about what next in these really big policy areas. People know that people's mental health have been affected. People know that people's jobs have been affected and their job security. So I think, you know, there is clearly an appetite here for some quite swift policy work and some clear objectives. And obviously, when it comes to the Labour Party, you know, the NHS is obviously something that the Labour Party talks a lot about and always has done. And I think there is, you know, there is an obvious place over the next weeks and months to go to there about setting some clear targets, if you like, about what this should mean for the NHS and what rebuilding should mean for the NHS over the next couple of years. The only other chart I wanted to share with everybody was this one. This one seemed to interest people on social media when it was released earlier this week. This shows you some of the differences in prioritisation between 2019 Conservative voters and 2019 Labour voters. Now, as you can see, when we think about the top two, the NHS, unemployment and jobs, you know, both groups of voters prioritise those two things. Below that, you see some interesting differences. And there are a few comments that people offered when we discussed this. Quite a few people looked at that town high street regeneration stat, and people offered a variety of comments. Some people suggested, well, look, perhaps this shows that the government's levelling up language is present, and that people understand it. Obviously, towns have been discussed by Labour quite a lot recently too, right? So, you know, Lisa Nandy famously talking about towns quite a bit during the last leadership election. I think Annalise Dodds announced a commission about high street regeneration during the local election campaign. So it does seem that Labour are on the pitch on this particular issue, and, you know, probably with good reason, particularly if Labour are trying to win back some of those 2019 Conservative voters. But we found that difference in prioritisation quite interesting, and obviously there are others, you know, policing, criminal justice, poverty, and things like that. There's a lot in the report overall. I didn't want to go too big on the slides and turn it into a lecture, but there's quite a lot on spending as well. So there was a general appetite for increased spending, and that covered most of the priorities that we saw in the Build Back Better list. So, you know, particularly with the National Health Service and social care, and it went wider than that in terms of protecting the environment. There was a general appetite for increased spending. We asked a bit also about, you know, how to pay for it, and, you know, we saw similar answers to other surveys, including very long-standing surveys about, you know, very little appetite for cutting taxes and cutting spending. You know, that's a fairly long-standing thing. There was an appetite for increased taxes and spending. We asked a question which was particularly about, you know, the person. So would you be prepared to pay more tax for increased public spending? We got a similar result, although the proportion of people who were more open to cuts to public services increased. We also asked a question about whether people felt they were paying the right amount of tax. And, you know, a pretty large group of people felt they were paying the right amount of tax. So, you know, what do we take from that? I think, you know, personally, what I take from that is if you want to proceed with, you know, big plans, including more spending, you've got to make a case for it. And at the moment, you know, I think there's been some debate, are we going to sort of have a 1945 moment and things like that? You know, we can't answer that with this research, but I think certainly these events or these moments don't just happen. You know, they're about ideas, public attitudes coming together and making a case for these kinds of things. So I'll just stop sharing that for a second now. I mean, just to finish up before I hand over to Chris, I think obviously surveys don't tell policymakers what to do. They don't give political parties narratives, nor should we want them to. You know, they're part of the discourse, and as I said, I think we can see that the public are really seriously engaged with some of the serious consequences of COVID. I mean, my interpretation of what this means for the Labour Party, I think two things really. I think the first is about the party being really clear right now about its purpose. And I think this word purpose sometimes can get mixed up with a word like vision. I don't think that Labour needs a vision right now, a complete vision. These things develop over time, but they do need a clear purpose. What is Labour about right now? What do we want to see happen in politics at this moment in time? What are our 2 or 3 things that we want to see happen now? And I think that's going to be really important for Labour over the coming months, is just a clear differentiation and a clear purpose. And then the final thing I want to say, which is related to that, is in political science, there's this phrase catch-all parties, which is quite well known. And some understandings of that are just about trying to build as wide an electoral coalition as possible, and obviously that always sounds like a good idea. I think there's sometimes a danger, though, that people have interpreted this catch-all parties phrase as perhaps saying as little as possible to avoid putting people off. And particularly in opposition, that can be quite an attractive thing. You don't want to say something that might prevent people from voting for you. That's one way of looking at it, but I think it's bad politics, right? If you want to build a coalition, you have to build one, and you have to build that from a sense of what you're in politics for and why people should go along with that particular project. So to just wrap up and pass on to Chris, I think this conference is in some ways a good idea of moving on. Progress as an organisation, moving on, and I think the party moving on, as Keir Starmer was saying earlier, sort of what next and the future is really, really important. But clarity of purpose over the next year, I think, is essential. Chris.
Thanks. And yeah, no, unfortunately, you've touched on some of the themes that I'm also going to talk about, so I'll try and talk about those a bit quicker. But yeah, I'm going to sort of, obviously, people were following, I'm sure, the local election results very closely, and I could make an argument for why I don't think that they were as bad as they looked. But either way, we've come out of this in a position where, again, the Labour Party feels like it's been a very tough situation. Our opinion poll that was out this morning in the Observer showed roughly a 13-point lead, or a 13-point lead for the Conservative Party. We're seeing, again, big differences between the popularity of the leaders of the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. And again, I think we therefore need to start thinking about how we turn these numbers around. Conservative has been ahead of the Labour Party for most of the past 11 years and 15 years, and we seriously need to start to think about how we turn those things around. But in doing so, I think it's probably quite important to avoid kind of another very long conversation about exactly why it's going wrong, because I feel like we actually have a pretty damn good answer to that question now, having spent 6 years trying to answer it. And I say that because I was writing my notes, and to be honest with you, it's very, very easy as a pollster and a political researcher to come here and to tell you sort of hilarious anecdotes about what one person said in a focus group, or what animal they think the Labour Party is, and to be able to diagnose the problem is the easiest job in the world. The real difficult task, which the Labour Party seriously needs to start moving on to, is taking what we know as the problems the party face, notably that they're not particularly seen as good at running things, and secondly, that increasingly few people, particularly sort of left-leaning socially conservative voters, increasingly few people actually see the party as willing to stand up and defend them. We need to take those problems, which we know, and we've seen them in research over the years, and we need to start coming up with solutions to them. So, I mean, I've tried to, and I don't necessarily have all of the answers, and I think it is a big essay question, but the essay question has to be how you solve them. I've tried to come up with some thoughts that I've had based on the research that I've been doing in recent years for what I think the Labour Party needs to start to be doing to solve these problems. The first, and it might be one that's specifically related to this moment, but nonetheless important, is that you can't land the kind of attacks on this government that you used to be able to land. And I think the Labour Party's default position is all too often to just attack and criticise the Conservatives. And all too often that goes down incredibly badly with voters and ends up hurting the popularity of the Labour Party more than it hurts the popularity of the Conservative Party. The amount of times I've sat in focus groups in recent months and heard people describe the Labour Party as being petty and childish because of the things that it's saying about the government, and saying that they don't like the Labour Party, that they like the Labour Party even less because of the attacks that the party is making is shocking. And quite often the attacks that the Labour Party makes on the Conservative Party are not seen to be in the vein of the priorities that people have in this country. So rather than talking about those, we're talking about different issues, and therefore we're alienating ourselves even more. So I think that the Labour Party should think a lot more carefully before it starts to attack and criticise the government. So be more positive in its vision rather than negative. And when it does, it needs to make sure that it's in tune with the priorities of the country, and it also needs to make sure that it tells a story for how it would solve those problems better. So I think, for example, one of the biggest criticisms that Labour needs to be levelling against this government is the idea that they're wasting taxpayers' money, and they're wasting taxpayers' money by giving private sector contracts that aren't delivering. And the Labour Party wouldn't be giving those private sector contracts out that don't deliver. And you can therefore see that you've got a narrative there that's an attack which is seen as relevant and important. And the Labour Party has a solution to it that is rooted in the Labour Party's values and the things that the people already associate with the party. So I think Labour needs to be a lot more careful and think a lot more carefully about how it attacks. Do it less, but when it does it, do it in a more targeted and effective way. Secondly, and I think this links more onto Karl's points, in particular, he sort of had a bit of a discussion there about tax and spend. And to be honest with you, I'm increasingly convinced that the Labour Party should not run away from or be scared of telling people that they're going to raise their taxes. You basically, the British public, rightly or wrongly, see economics as a zero-sum game. So you've got three options. You either, one, tell people that you're not going to increase spending in public services, or you've got two, you say you're going to increase government debt or deficit, or three, you admit you're going to raise their taxes. If you don't do one of those three options, the public just don't believe anything that you say. And that's been one of the problems for the Labour Party in recent years. They don't believe the promises that you make for public spending because but for one of those three reasons. So you have to say, I think the Labour Party's best option is to say that they're going to raise their taxes. And for all of the reasons that Karl said, that is not as alienating or as unpopular with the British public as many people in politics think it is. One of the reasons for that is, of course, that there's this thermostatic effect. So when you have a Conservative government in place, people start to swing to the left on economics. When you've got a Labour Party in place, people start to swing to the right on economics. So after 11 years of Conservative government, and don't get me wrong, it's one where many of the rules of politics haven't applied, but over those 11 years, people have still shifted to the left on economics, which is why Labour would be able to get away with this higher tax, higher spend proposal, which I think would be the best position for them. It's also worth noting that perhaps unlike in the 1990s, there's a lot more retired people in this country who wouldn't be asked who wouldn't be paying this extra tax that we're suggesting. These are also a really crucial set of voters for the Labour Party to win back if they're going to win an election. Older voters, they're the people who are most pro-tax because they're not paying it, and most pro-spend because they're particularly using the public services. So I think it's sort of, psychologically speaking, quite a good policy that could land particularly well. And in terms of precedent, I'd also point out that if you look back over the polling in the New Labour's years, Gordon Brown's most popular budget was the one where he actually levelled with the public and said, yes, I'm going to ask you to pay a bit more tax. I think he put national insurance up in order to pay for the NHS. So I think the Labour Party's convinced itself that it couldn't go into an election saying it's going to raise taxes. And to be honest with you, I think that that's completely wrong. And actually, it could be an incredibly effective, powerful policy. The third thing, I think the Labour Party, and I'm sure people on this call accept that there is a centre ground on economic policy. I've just spoken a bit why it is perhaps more left-wing than it used to be, but I think we also need to accept that there is a centre ground on, there's not a good word for this, but let's for now call it cultural issues. Those things that are on a slightly different dimension, immigration, Brexit being two key issues. And I think if the Labour Party and people on this call accept that the Labour Party needs to place itself in the centre ground on economics and is willing to criticise other people in the party for not accepting that, I think we also need to accept that the Labour Party needs to put itself in the centre ground on those issues or risk alienating a lot of voters. And I think that's going to be very, very difficult for a lot of people in the Labour Party, because it is going to mean the Labour Party saying things that, are uncomfortable to us. because that's where the country is. But I think that it'd be increasing, and the Labour Party needs to think about how it does it. It needs to do it in a way that doesn't alienate people, and obviously it needs to do it in a way that doesn't separate us from our values, which is crucially important. But it is worth noting, of course, that the public do disagree with many people inside the Labour Party on lots of things, and the Labour Party does need to think about about how they don't alienate those voters. The fourth thing, Labour needs to speak in the language that people actually use and understand. Doing polling on words like, even during the election campaign, with the Labour Party was going around saying sleaze and cronyism. People think sleaze is to do with porn mags, and nobody really knows what the word cronyism means. So it's very, very difficult for those messages to hit home. Meanwhile, Boris Johnson was going to Hartlepool and saying jobs, 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 jabs, jabs, jabs. And everything the Labour Party says, we need to be thinking about whether people understand it, whether we're using the kind of language that is used by normal people in their lives. And if we're not, they're going to see us as even more out of touch. And I think all too often we are doing that. Number 5, I think Labour politicians need to think about how they look and sound more authentic. The best politicians, and Boris Johnson's the absolute best in the world at this, is incredibly good at hitting his message time and time and time again, but doing so in a way that looks and sounds authentic. So he doesn't look like he's really trying to hit a message. And you hear people in focus groups who can tell this. One of the things that people say about politicians and one of the big criticisms they make is like, oh, he just doesn't seem authentic. He doesn't seem, and basically it comes down to this fact that they are constantly trying to, they come across like they're constantly trying to hit a message, hit a note. And I think basically trying to be able to do that, but without looking like you're trying so hard, can be incredibly effective. And the Labour Party needs to think about ways that their key politicians can do that. And finally, the 6th one I've got here is to make sure the Labour Party learns from Wales. The success story in Wales really, really shouldn't be understated. And I think that one of the main reasons why Labour, after God knows how many years in government in Wales, has managed to pull off such a successful election victory is because Welsh people basically still feel like the Labour Party is the best place to represent them, to stick up for them, in a way that the Labour Party's lost in other parts of the UK, such as Scotland and in, of course, parts of the Red Wall. So learning about how they've done that over the past few years, there is a party in Wales that is literally called the Party of Wales, and yet if you ask most Welsh people, they'd say the Labour Party is the Party of Wales. And being able to pull that off whilst being in government over such a long period of time, I think shouldn't be understated. So the ways the Labour Party can look at what they've done in Wales and try to replicate that over other parts of the country, I think is an incredibly important thing to do, and something that the party can learn from. And the final note I'd make is just one a little bit of hope, because I feel like after bad election results, it is very easy to get down within the Labour Party. But it's also worth noting that the electorate is a hell of a lot more fickle than they used to be. They used to have the case that there was a lot of loyal Labour Party voters, there was a lot of loyal Conservative Party voters, so things didn't move around so much. The Conservative Party in the past 3 years has polled anywhere between 16% and about 55%. These polling numbers do move around a lot more than they used to. And what that means is it's very easy to go very quickly from a resounding election defeat to actually being able to pull the party back, just because of how fickle voters are now. So I think that, yes, it feels bad, but if the Labour Party can solve these problems, it isn't necessarily going to take us long to come back and to fight back from these bad set of elections, as it maybe would have done in the 80s. But my God, do they need to fix the problems that they have? And on that note, I'll pass over to Sunny. I think you're on mute, Sunny.
Have to start with the traditional way, don't I? Hi, everyone. My name is Sunny Hundal. I'm a journalist, a Labour member, and sometimes that annoying guy on Twitter. And I write mostly about identity politics and belonging. And I actually want to start by saying how amazing it is just to be here today. When I first joined the Labour Party in 2010, I was in the Ed Miliband wing of the party. And progress in those days was the enemy. And a decade later, I think I realized two things about the Labour Party. Firstly, I think it was arrogant of me to think that all we needed was just some nice policies and a nice leader and we'd win. And I think there's a lot that Labour members can learn from each other, from different wings of the party. And sometimes I do think we need some humility to do that, to learn from each other. Also, I think that no one out there cares for what faction of the Labour Party we're in. To them, we're all the same. And I think that the policies we talk about are as important as how we talk to people. And that's the challenge for all of us in Labour, not just a certain faction. So here I am from what you call the soft left of the Labour Party, trying to figure out our future just like all of you. So welcome. Thanks for joining me today. I'm here to talk to Bridget Phillipson MP and Anna Sarwar MSP. Please do put your questions in the chat. I'm going to start with them, just ask them a couple of questions, but I want to get questions from all of you guys as well. Bridget is Labour MP for Horton and Sunderland South, Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury. Anna Sarwar is the leader of Scottish Labour. Welcome to both of you. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having us, Sonny.
And I'm going to start with you, if that's all right. For as long as I've followed your career, you've been very confident and proud of your identities as an Asian, as being a Muslim, and being Scottish. I think you may have noticed by now that some of us in England have a problem trying to figure out our English identity, to talk about progressive patriotism and what our identity might even look like. So I think Labour in England can learn a lot from you. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about what you think about progressive patriotism and how someone with multiple identities can embrace that and talk about it in a way that sounds appealing to the people of this country?
Thank you, Sonny, and can I thank all the team at Progressive Britain for the invitation and echo your earlier comments about how important it is that we pull the party together and recognise that our collective efforts goes beyond any kind of factional infighting that we might have been used to over the last number of years. Sonny, it's actually a really complicated question. I could probably take up the entire session answering it, so I'm going to try and keep it as brief as possible. The first part I'd say is, actually, I really struggled with my identity in the early part of my political career. So I've been doing this now for a decade. I know I don't look it, but I've been doing this for a decade, actually 11 years now. And the two most liberating experiences for me was my defeat in 2015 when we had the SNP landslide in Scotland at the general election, and then losing the actual leadership election in 2017, because both of those defeats, I honestly believe, made me more confident in myself in terms of my own identity, and gave me a real sense of what actually matters. And I think I've said this before, I think I'm a better politician for it. I think I'm a better human being for it. And I actually think I'm a better father for it as well. So all three of those aren't bad. Our challenge, right? Our fundamental challenge as a Labour Party, I think, is we don't do the politics of emotion, and we kind of think we ought almost think as if we've got to win the politics of ideas, and that's going to be enough for us to win elections. It's honestly not enough. We've learned that the hard way in Scotland. I think we're probably learning that the hard way so far in England, and I think Welsh Labour have probably done it the right way. Is we've got to compete with ourselves on ideas. We've got to have big ideas. We've got to demonstrate we've got big ideas. We've got to demonstrate we've got a plan to change the country, but we've also got to win on emotion as well. That's partly winning on the emotion of identity and belonging. And the other big error, and I've realised I've probably spoken for too long already, Sonny, is we cannot defeat the politics of us versus them by creating our own version of us versus them. I think we tried that and I think it failed. The way we are going to defeat the politics of us versus them, and whether that's the us versus them of Scottish independence, or it's the us versus them of Brexit Britain, or the us versus them of English identity that the Tories want to try and stoke, is we've got to win on a politics of empathy, a politics of unity, and a politics of hope. And that means being proudly Scottish in my case in Scotland. It means being proudly Welsh in the case of Welsh Labour. And the challenge I think you guys have in England is you get blowback when you try and show English pride, because the Welsh and the Scots naturally don't like it when English folk start showing English pride, right? So the rest of the UK Labour Party recoils. Actually, you've got to be proud in your identity. I'm a proud Glaswegian. I'm a proud Scot. I'm a proud Brit. There's no reason why other parts of the Labour Party can't do that as well. and compete on the politics of emotion if we are going to come back.
So just to follow up on that point, you said we shouldn't be afraid of being proud of identity. Do you think that Labour Party should be saying then that we're proud of our English identity?
I think it's different things for different parts. So I see nothing wrong with people in England being proud of their English identity as well as being proud of being part of the UK. If it's okay for me to do it in Scotland, why is it not okay for you to do it in England? Yes, there's a huge challenge we face in that 85% of our United Kingdom is one nation in terms of England. And that poses us difficulties in terms of devolution. It poses difficulty in terms of people feeling where the centre of decision making takes place. The answer to that is not to ignore your identity or to look like you're hiding one part of the UK or embarrassed of one part of the UK. It's about making sure how we make devolution work in different parts of the UK. And I think we still got a long way to go on that. But it's also about us projecting confidence in ourselves, because we have a dual problem in Scotland, right? We're a problem for you in the sense of you need the Scottish Labour Party to do better in order for us to have a UK-wide Labour government. And the challenge for us is we need you to do better, because we know from history that people will come back to the Labour Party if they think we're strongest and more likely to defeat the Tories and return a UK Labour government. In order to do that, you need to give us the leeway for us to have our own track for what's right for us as a Scottish party and also what's right for us in Scotland. And we've also got to give you a bit of leeway to do what you think is right in other parts of the UK as well. So I will lead a distinct, autonomous Scottish Labour Party that's not going to be afraid to tell the UK Labour Party when they get it wrong. It's not going to be afraid to pick fights with the UK Labour Party if it's the right thing for me to do for Scotland and for the Scottish Labour Party, because that's the right thing for us in Scotland. That might give us difficulties down the road sometimes, but it's the right thing for the Scottish Labour Party. And even though it might cause day-to-day difficulties on the rare occasion, it's the right thing for the UK Labour Party as well, because you need us to be better in Scotland.
Thanks, Anas. Bridget, if you don't mind, I want to come to you on a related question, slightly different though. You wrote an interesting article for the New Statesman in 2019 called "Labour Loves Nostalgia, but we succeed when our politics is about the future." And in that article, you said, on the left, we face a serious challenge in holding together a coalition of people whose social values are already more disparate than those of people on the right, and growing steadily more so. But it would be short-sighted to believe that telling people how different they are from the cosmopolitan urban liberals does anything other than play straight into the hands of Boris Johnson. Now, if you think there is a growing divide in social values in what is the new and what you could say is the old Labour base, and I agree with you on that, how do we bring those people together? Do we ignore those differences in social values and change the conversation, or do we jump straight in? And if yes, what does that look like?
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Sunny, and thanks to Progressive Britain and to having me along today. And it's wonderful to see Anas as well, who's doing a fantastic job. There's quite a lot to unpack there, and I'll just offer some broad observations as well about the elections that we just had and where we go next, I suppose. I mean, fundamentally, my starting point is that we win when we bring together that broad coalition with a future-facing vision about the kind of country that we want to build, and that involves looking to the future and not looking to the past. And you know, communities like mine have changed such a great deal over that period of time. You know, when I talk about nostalgia, you know, I'm very proud of the traditions that we have, but you know, the last coal mine in my community closed when I was a toddler, so things have changed and moved on a great deal. And I think what matters most is about jobs for the future for our young people and the new industries of the future, and making sure that we're very much focused on how we've got the best policies in place to achieve that. There's just a few comments I wanted to make really more broadly about the elections that we've just had, which you know weren't great for Labour, but after a miserable Friday, it did cheer me a little to look at the pattern in places that don't always count as quickly as we do in the northeast of England. And I think in many parts of England, we saw green shoots, or red shoots if you like, that should be a source of strength for the years ahead. But I think there's no running away from the big picture that these weren't the results that we wanted. I think You look to the vaccination programme, which is Britain's achievement, not simply a Tory achievement in England, but for exactly that reason, I don't think we can be surprised that people were prepared to vote Conservative in England, Labour in Wales and SNP in Scotland. And I don't mean for one moment to underplay the tremendous success of Mark Drakeford and his team in getting the most seats ever in the Senedd. And that brings me to a second point, which is that being in government during a crisis means that people see you tested. And in Mark's case, they saw him rise to and meet that challenge. But on the other side is that when there is a crisis and you're not in government, people aren't looking even as you change. And I think the Labour Party has changed an awful lot in these last 14 months. New leader in Scotland under Annas as well, new shadow cabinet with a new direction and a new focus. But people in England haven't really been so much looking at us, and party politics isn't what voters want in the middle of the pandemic, even as things are starting to return a bit more to normal right now. They're understandably focused on a global pandemic, on an unprecedented health emergency, worried about their health, their loved ones and their livelihoods. And that's, I think, what we've all been concerned about. What struck me on the doorsteps where I've been campaigning across the country, in Sunderland and in Hartlepool, in Hitchin, in Cambridge, in Basildon, is that the anger that was there in 2019 has started to go. I wasn't being chased off the doorsteps in the way that I was back in 2019. People were happy to see us, happy to chat, and we had really great conversations. But I think the miserable and bitter truth of that is that that does actually represent progress. Now, it's not a progress that we can measure in council seats, because to cease to be angry with us is not a reason to go out and vote for us. But it is a really important first step, because I think it does involve recognising the scale of the defeat that we suffered back in 2019. A reputation that takes years to build up can be destroyed overnight, and that can be as true in politics as in anything else. And we need to claw back that reputation, but it might not be as quick as any of us would like. So I think as we look to the future, it has to be about addressing people's hopes and fears and providing that kind of vision about the country that we want to build. I think if you look across the Atlantic to Biden, he concentrated very much on earning trust before he could deliver the change that America desperately needed. And I think that really is a lesson for us all. I think when we look at the change that we want to secure, for me, our politics should be about enabling and empowering everyone to succeed in their lives, wherever they happen to live and whatever they do. And a real belief that our best days lie ahead of us. And I think that's entirely possible, because I think people, whether they're in Sunderland or Stonehaven or Swansea, in big cities and small towns, have more in common than we sometimes tell ourselves. They want decent local services to be proud of, children's centres, libraries, leisure centres, a secure job and the chance to get on in life, greater opportunities for their children, to be able to spend time with friends and family and not to be worried about what the future holds, and to feel safe in your community, and to know that care will be there for you when you're ill and into old age or whenever you need it. So I do genuinely believe that this is a challenge that we can meet. I think under Keir Starmer's leadership, we're on the process of making that change within the party and looking outward to the voters. And I think what's absolutely essential in the months and years ahead is how we focus on building that positive, hopeful and optimistic vision of the kind of Britain we can build right through into the 2030s.
Thanks, Bridget. I do want to sort of come back to the question, though, which is about different groups of the Labour coalition who we think have maybe different social values, and how you think we could bring those people together. Now, you answered part of that, and I know that I'm sure you want to do that, bring that out again, but on the doorstep, if you have someone who says to you that, they don't feel like the Labour Party represents sort of the towns and the villages in this country and focuses more on sort of the metropolitan urban liberals, that's something that we talk about a lot. And that's something that Tony Blair raised recently in his, article as well. And he said specifically, we have to not avoid that conversation. We have to confront that conversation. So if someone did come up to you on the doorstep and said, I think the Labour Party does not represent my values, what do you say to them? What do you say to them?
I think first of all, we have to be willing to listen to the voters and meet them where they are, not where we would wish them to be. And I think that's a really important step, because we have a lot of discussions internally as a party, and sometimes it's not always with reference to where voters are. I think much of it does rest on the big economic questions as much as on, what people tend to talk about in terms of cultural values. I mean, for many people, they want a sense of safety and security within their communities, and that has disappeared over the course of the last 10 years. And I think part of that has given rise to some of the wider fractures that we've seen within our society. I mean, I fundamentally believe, however, that where Labour has succeeded in the past and where we'll succeed again is where we build that coalition that can straddle it. And I think much of it does rest on that economic message. I think there's also a degree to which the views of voters are somewhat misunderstood, and frankly, there's a degree to which voters are patronised, I think, for the views that they hold. I don't believe people in Sunderland are fundamentally very different to people in other parts of the country, and I think it's how we build a message about the future of Britain that brings people together around a shared vision of the future that allows us to recognise that we won't always agree on everything, and that no one government is ever seen to have got things right. But where, if they believe that there is hope for the future around jobs for their children, around security at work, that they can feel safe in their community and safe in the home, that I think gets you a long way to addressing some of those wider tensions that exist. But I caught part of the earlier discussion that was taking place, and I thought Chris Curtis's point around the fact that voters move around more between parties is a really important one. I think that's presented challenges for us as a party, but I think it presents real opportunities as well. So, and I think much of the framing that often characterises the debate, the narrative of the so-called red wall, a term I don't think is actually especially helpful in explaining very much or getting us very far. I think misunderstands and sometimes risks overemphasising the differences that exist between voters, when I believe that fundamentally most people will want the same things. But I think what does matter is Labour demonstrating that we have a sense of belief in our country, that doesn't mean believing that everything we've done before is wonderful or perfect, but I think it's about recognising that voters want things to improve and to be better into the future, and that we can provide that optimistic vision of how things can be better still, but we're not seen as wanting to talk down our country, or we always be negative in identifying the faults that exist. And believe me, there are plenty of problems in our country, and that's why I joined the Labour Party. But I think it's being focused on improving and developing.
You're on mute, Sonny, sorry.
Sorry, it's terrible, isn't it? Bridget, sorry, just one more question for you. And this is about spending, right? Boris Johnson you're Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury. And at the same time, we live at a time when the current Tory government is not afraid of spending a lot of money, right? That puts the Labour Party on a bit of a we're no longer left to argue for more spending because the Tories are already doing it, and the Tories are redefining themselves as a heavy spending party. How exactly is the Labour Party going to figure out a message in this context where the Tories have no problem standing on the taps and the Labour Party is, in some cases, arguing for not raising taxes? What kind of a clear message are we going to have?
So first off, I think we need to recognise that many of the measures the government put in place were absolutely necessary, and it represents what's taken place in other parts of the world. That said, I think the furlough scheme shows what can be done when business, trade unions and government work together. So I think there's some really good examples of things that have worked in the pandemic. Where it comes to how public money is being spent, I mean, I would make a distinction between spending lots of money and spending it well and spending it effectively. And I think during this crisis, we've seen the government spend an awful lot of money, often on contracts that didn't deliver, whether it's masks that didn't work, or also not targeting money effectively to people that have found themselves in really difficult situations. You know, look at the impact on the excluded. So many people who have found that in their hour of need, they're not eligible for universal credit, and the government support schemes that are in place are not available to them. They find that absolutely astounding, as do I, and the complete intransigence of the government. I mean, this is always a challenge for Labour, and I accept that we do have to continue to do that work. Something I'll be working on really hard with Rachel Reeves to establish Labour's position as a party of economic credibility, and that we recognise and understand the importance of always getting best value for public money. And for me, that's about the outcomes that you get from it. What is it that we want to achieve in the spending of public money? My worry about how the government has approached this is that I think it risks eroding public confidence in the role of government as a force for good in people's lives. I think we can achieve remarkable things where we spend public money effectively. I'll just give one personal example. I was one of probably a very small number of MPs who received the Labour government's education maintenance allowance when I was doing my A-levels. And that made a real difference to my life. It wasn't a huge government programme. It wasn't as big as many of the programmes that we've seen during the pandemic, but it made it far easier for me to focus on my studies. It made life a lot easier. And I know the impact it had on so many people that I was at school with. I think we recognise that where we spend money, we spend it to get the best possible outcomes. And I am really concerned that the way in which the government has approached this and the frankly irresponsible manner in which some public money has been handed out risks undermining that as a concept and as a principle. And I think it's really important for us as Labour politicians and as a party to not just recognise the value of public money and how it's spent, but that when we're doing it, we've really got to make sure it's focused on achieving the best possible outcomes for our country.
Thank you. Anas, if you don't mind, I want to come back to you with a question. What do you think about the devolution debate? I mean, some people say that the Scottish Labour Party should be more independent and maybe even sort of almost be seen as, you know, making an alliance with the Labour Party in England, but actually much more independent of what happens in the south of the border. What do you say to that? Does Scottish Labour need more independence from Labour Party in England?
So we certainly need an autonomous Scottish Labour Party. And actually there was an autonomy agreement signed by Kes Dugdale when she was leader with Jeremy Corbyn when he was leader. But I think the fundamental problem we've had is one of relationships rather than about rules. And you can write the best model of rules and operational organizational setup in the world. If you have conflicting personalities and conflicting ideals, that's going to be pulled apart. So we've got to have a respect agenda, which is around autonomy for the Scottish Labour Party. And that's why I've been very clear with Keir, and I'm sure he's in no doubt. I'm the boss in Scotland. I decide what happens in Scotland. I will shape what's best for Scotland. That's better for him. It's also better for us in Scotland. And we have that mutual respect. I want him to be Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And the best way I can help achieve that is by building and having a autonomous, outward-looking, forward-looking Scottish Labour Party. And we've got hard work to build that. I'm not going to pretend that work is anywhere near complete. Sonny, you can see from the election result we had, people feel good about the result in Scotland, but it actually wasn't a good result in Scotland. The reason why people feel good about the result is because we see what could have happened and we averted an absolute disaster happening. We've got a sense of hope and optimism again, but in many ways, we pretended we had a political party for 10 weeks since I became leader in order for us to get through the first 4 weeks of the Parliament, to get through the 6 weeks of election campaign. We've now got to build a party in Scotland, and I'm very determined for us to do that. Can I just come back to one thing that you asked Bridget about, which was around the red wall and also around, you know, how we talk to parts of the electorate. I would remind people the first red wall to fall was Scotland. And quite often people forget the first red wall was to fall with Scotland. Unless we rebuild the Scottish red wall, we ain't going to have a UK Labour government. So that's a point I'm always very keen to make when speaking to audiences outside of Scotland. The second point I make is, for too long, we've seemed angry with the electorate, as if we're annoyed with them. Why? How dare you not vote for us? Right? Or we look like we think we're more intelligent than the electorate to say, we've got the best ideas in the world. Are you too stupid not to vote for us? We've given that approach. Sometimes we've looked like, particularly in working class communities, I think, we've looked like we're lecturing working class communities rather than working with working class communities, as if we know better what's right for you rather than actually engaging with you directly. I think that's the wrong approach for us as well. And we've got to learn the lessons of the Brexit debate. We've got to learn the lessons of what Boris is trying to do in terms of emotion, and we've got to learn the lessons of the independence debate. And for far too often, and please, this is my plea to you guys in England and the rest of the UK, is those voters that we lost that went and voted Conservative, do not think of them as Tories. And this is the mistake we made in Scotland, is that when we lost votes to the SNP, we labelled them Nats. They're nationalists. And when we lost votes to the Tories, we label them as, oh, they're Tories. And now when we're trying to win those voters back, people say, oh, you're trying to get Tories to vote Labour, or you're trying to get nationalists to vote Labour. No, we're trying to get Scottish people to vote Labour. And it's not their fault that they didn't think we were good enough. And that's why they went to vote for other political parties. And so let's not talk down to them. Let's give them something else to vote for that meets their ambition, but also meets the emotional connection we need to have with them as well. And that's why I keep hammering home this point. I know I've said it a few times today, I've said it deliberately, is we have got to compete on the politics of emotion as well as the politics of ideas. And we don't do it by further dividing our country. And this is, I think, the big mistake that I think we risk making, is we think we're up against divisive politicians. And the way we defeat divisive politicians is if we create our own division and hope we win a different kind of people. That's not how we do it. And actually, we can learn a lesson from the other side of the Atlantic. If Biden had tried to confront Trump with a different version of us versus them, he would have got gubbed. He would have got beat. Instead, he confronted the politics of division with a message about how to bring the country back together again, about the shared ideals and shared ideas. Not saying we're going to agree on everything. So there are lots of things with people in Scotland that I'm going to disagree on. But what I'm going to say directly to people in Scotland is, see that one thing we disagree on, are we really going to allow that to stop us making progress on the 99 things we agree on? And having that honest, engaging, emotional conversation with people, trying to heal the wounds in our country rather than to expand and create new wounds in our country, is the way we're going to win the country back. And please learn that lesson from us in Scotland. We've got a lot of work to do in that, but don't make the same mistakes as we made. Learn from us, and we can have a Labour government again.
One more specific question to you, Anas. There are some in the Labour Party who say we need to have create a progressive alliance with other parties. And if you remember, in 2010, that included the SNP in Scotland, who, some people were arguing for that at Miliband too in 2015. What would you say to those people?
I would very directly say to people, do not think the SNP is the Labour Party with a saltire. They are not. There is nothing progressive about trying to break up the United Kingdom. There is nothing progressive about imposing even deeper, darker austerity on our country, on our nation, because in the name of identity. There's nothing progressive about that at all. And one of the big challenges we face in Scotland is there are so many people in England, with all due respect, I'm just going to be upfront and say it, who think one of the ways of having a go at the Tories is to side with the SNP or to talk up what the SNP are doing. All they're doing is using a problem down there to reflect a problem up here. And that's the wrong approach. We already have a progressive alliance. It's called the Labour Party. And so let's call out the SNP for what they are. Let's not do it in an angry way. Let's not do it by talking down Scotland or giving them that easy get a jail free card that somehow we think Scots aren't able to do things themselves. Let's do it in a positive, alternative way. So if you want to build a progressive alliance, do it by finding progressive people and voters across the country to build an alliance that can return a UK-wide Labour government. That's how we do it. And that's my plea to people. Don't think the SNP are our friends. They want to break the United Kingdom. They want to defeat the Labour movement and the Labour Party because they know that's how they get independence. Don't fall for the trap.
Thanks. Bridget, I want to come back to you if you don't mind. Free broadband, right? That was an issue that came up a lot in the last election. But I think that in a way, this whole idea about free broadband talks about idea of the digital infrastructure in the UK and about how maybe the Labour Party needs to embrace new forms of, you know, the digital infrastructure, talk about digital infrastructure in the way that we have talked about other infrastructure in the UK. Now, the Labour Party doesn't really have that much, or hasn't traditionally had much to say about technology, much to say about the future and how technology can play a part in changing our lives, in making our lives better. Do you agree with that? And would you offer people free broadband?
I think technology and access to broadband is incredibly important. I mean, it was before the pandemic, and I think it's highlighted just how important it is now. I think on that point about manifestos and commitments, I mean, clearly, you know, that will be a process that will develop in the years ahead. I think I'm less interested in what was in the manifesto of 2019 or 2017 or 1997. I want for us to be looking to the kind of Britain that we want to build right through the 2030s. I think the point about many of the individual policies within those manifestos, every Labour manifesto that's gone to the country in my lifetime, there were parts in there, of course, that were straightforwardly Labour, that we could all get behind, that, you know, are uncontroversial. I think the challenge for us as a party is not just having a perfect policy offer, but in actually persuading people that they can trust us to deliver on it, that we don't just have the right values, that we don't just have the right policies, but that we're trusted and credible and that we can do it and deliver it. And I think that also goes to Anas's point around that connection that we need to make with the voters that goes beyond having a perfect set of policies. I mean, as much as every other Labour Party member, I would happily debate for hours on end what that perfect policy offer might be. The challenge is how you then communicate it, especially in a world where, frankly, most voters are not political obsessives like us, who like doing this kind of thing on a Sunday morning, who are getting on with their lives, you know, getting their kids off to football, you know, cooking the lunch. We've got a very limited space often to get our message through. And that's why it's really important that it's not just rooted in the areas of people's lives that they feel is most important, and jobs, you know, schools, hospitals, the chance to get on in life, but they believe that we can do it and that we can deliver it and that we're credible. And that's part of the task that we've got ahead of us in the months to come.
Okay, I need some final thoughts from you because we're coming to the end of the session. So looking ahead, Bridget and Anas, Bridget, if you want to go first, just give us your closing thoughts on where the Labour Party needs to look ahead.
You know, I know it's been a bruising period. It's always tough when you've come through elections and you've not done as well as you might. But I genuinely believe that the Labour Party can and will win again. And we'll do that by having a vision that's rooted in a positive and hopeful offer for the British people. You know, let's look back to 97. It was then written that there'd been a realignment in British politics and the Tories would never win again. And yet here we are right now with the Tory government with a whopping great majority. We've got a big job ahead. You know, 2019 was a terrible election for us, but I'm confident that in Keir Starmer, people see someone who could be the Prime Minister of our country. And I think the challenge that we have in the months and years ahead is to demonstrate to the voters, firstly, that they can trust us, that they're willing to listen to us, and then setting out how we can build a better Britain for every family and every part of our country.
Anas, you want to go ahead?
Thanks, Sonny. A few things. One, don't think there is some silver bullet policy that's going to get us there. Second, there is no quick constitutional fix that resolves all of our problems, whether that's a constitutional fix to Brexit or a constitutional fix to independence. There isn't a quick fix. The way we win back is be authentic, energy, ideas, emotion, getting out there, empathy, unity, and giving people hope. That's the way we're going to win back. And I honestly think, and I'm pleased that Bridget got the same sense and emotion on the doorsteps in Sunderland as we got in Scotland, is the biggest thing for us in Scotland was I could have taken the approach in Scotland, which was, I'm going to throw everything at this one election campaign, and if it means burning the house down with half of Scotland or 3/4 of Scotland, so be it, to try and maximise our share of the vote. I was not willing to do that, because the much greater prize for us is to get back on the pitch and for people to think we're on their side again. And I think we have got back on the pitch in Scotland. I think there is a hope and optimism amongst our activists again. I think our voters are no longer embarrassed to publicly say they're voting Labour again, which is in itself a huge bit of progress in the last 10 years. We've got to build on it though. And we do it by being ourselves and not looking inwards. See if you think the opponents inside the Labour Party, you're in the wrong job and you're in the wrong party. Seriously. We've got to start looking outwards rather than looking inwards, and we've got to start giving people the positive message about what Labour can do to compete and create a different kind of Scotland, a different kind of UK. And it's got to be values driven and ideas driven. But as I say again right at the start, it's got to be backed up with people feeling good about ourselves. We can't look like we dislike Scotland or we dislike Britain or we dislike parts of the country. We've got to look like we love the country, because we do, and we want to make it a better place.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Bridget Phillipson and Anna Sarwar, for joining me, and thank you to Progressive Britain for holding this. And I'm going to hand it back to Nathan, who's going to take us on to the other sections.
Hi, thanks, Sonny. Thanks to Anas, Bridget, but also to Wes, to Ashley, to Keir, to Karl, to Chris, and all of you for joining in for this. What a big day for us. A lot of work has gone into this, and so far, I think we're off to a flying start. I'll be back at the end of the day to tell you a bit more about what we're hoping to do with Progressive Britain, and crucially, how you guys can get involved. But right now, I'm the designated housekeeper. So you should all have received your Word document with your credentials today. And in that document now, you've got, there's a grid, there's a pick and mix of 12 sessions for you to choose from. So basically, you go into that document, there's a hyperlink in each section, click the session you want, and a Zoom meeting room will appear. You'll be glad to know we're going back into normal meeting styles for this afternoon. I've been told to say that we have to start at 12 promptly. I'm already late, so I'll leave you to it. Back here promptly at 3 for the opening session of the afternoon, when Lord M is going to tell us why now is the time for Progressive Britain. But before then, enjoy the sessions, and thanks for coming.